You grow your peanuts and plenty millet. The king sets a hand on everything and says it is not yours anymore. In the deepest of your sleep, the king beats his drum and says, "Wake up, you are not free anymore." The appalling shock of free people being seized and enslaved is captured in this griot storyteller song of the West African people called the Wolof. European nations, driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries, established new maritime empires and administered trading posts in Asia and Africa and colonies in the Americas. Asian trade frequently exchanged silver and gold for luxury goods, such as silk and spices, while newly developed colonial economies in the Americas often depended on agriculture. American plantations relied on an existing labor systems and also introduced new labor systems. Among these were indentured servitude, arrangements through which servants contracted to work for a specified period of time. Another was chattel slavery, a system in which individuals were considered as property to be bought and sold. At first, the British created trading posts that were similar to other European countries. The East Indian Company established small forts on the coast that focused solely on making a profit through trade. However, the East Indian Company then began to expand. It took advantage of the tensions between Muslims and Hindus in India and began to increase its political power through treaties with local rulers. With the help of European trained Indian private forces called sepoys, the East Indian Company moved inland, spreading its influence. Ultimately, British intervened in Indian political and military to such an extent that it controlled much of the subcontinent. In the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, Spain and Portugal divided the Americas between them. Spain reserved all the lands west of the meridian, and Portugal reserved all the lands east of this line. This arrangement put Brazil under Portugal's rule, while Spain claimed the rest of the Americas. In addition to establishing colonies, they also explored. An early Spanish explorer in 1569 founded the first continuous settlement in the United States called St. Augustine. Spain would not be able to control North America due to the French, British, and Dutch making claims there. France and Britain continued to vie for dominance in North America. As British settlers moved into the former Dutch territory of Upper New York, they began to form ties with the powerful Iroquois, who had been in conflict with the French over trade issues for decades. The British hoped that the Iroquois could frustrate French trade interests. Over time, the Iroquois began to realize that the British posed more of a threat than the French. In a shift of alliances, the Iroquois and the French signed a peace treaty known as the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. In the same war in which Britain drove France out of India, the British drove France out of Canada as well. The North American portion of this war is sometimes called the French and Indian War. In the early 1500s, the Spanish established a system called the Encomienda system to gain access to gold and other resources of the Americas. Encomenderos, or landowners, compelled indigenous people to work for them in exchange for food and shelter. This system was similar to the one where serfs worked on the manor in Europe. This labor system was notorious for its brutality and harsh living conditions. While gold did not yield riches for Spanish conquistadors, the discovery of silver in Mexico and Peru did revive economic fortunes for both individual explorers and Spain. For this industry, though, to flourish, Spanish prospectors needed labor. The indigenous populations would do all but the most dangerous work in the mines. In response, the Spanish authorities in Peru transformed the traditional Inca Maita system for labor obligation, in which young men were required to devote a certain amount of labor to public works projects, into a forced labor system. Villages were compelled to send a percentage of their male population to do the dangerous work in mines for no wages. The silver trade not only made individual Spanish prospectors wealthy, it also strengthened the Spanish economy. European powers at the time were adopting mercantilism, an economic system that increased government control of the economy through high tariffs and the establishment of colonies. In the case of Spain, the main purpose of the colonies in Americas was to supply as much gold and silver as possible. Another way to increase national wealth, according to the mercantilist system, was for a colonizing country to export more than it imported. A percentage of overseas silver production went directly to the Spanish crown. The empire used this wealth to build up a military and establish foreign trade. Several factors converged to make Africa a target for slave raids by Europeans after 1450. Slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean began toward the end of the 16th century when European conquistadors sought fortunes in gold, silver, and sugar. Land was plentiful, but labor to make the land profitable was scarce. Europeans initially forced indigenous people to do the hard labor of mining and farming, but European diseases all but wiped them out. The indigenous slaves who did survive often escaped bondage because they knew the territory. They could easily hide and camouflage themselves within the native population. Repeated efforts to enslave Native Americans failed, although other efforts to force labor did have some success. In North America, plantation owners recruited European indentured servants at first, mostly to grow tobacco for a specified period in exchange for passage, room, and board. However, most of these people were not used to the backbreaking agricultural working conditions and the climate of the Americas. In addition, indentured servants were required to work for only about 7 years. If they survived their indentured, they became free laborers. Thus, landowners did not think of indigenous captives and European indentured servants as ideal workers. Capturing Africans for slavery was invariably the result. Captive Africans swept away from their families were taken to holding pens in West Africa known as barracoons, or slave castles. The modern country of Ghana has preserved these points of no return, where thousands upon thousands of Africans saw their homeland for the last time. From these holding pens, slave traders next crammed their captives into the dank cargo section of a ship, providing them with little water, food, or even room for movement. The grueling journey across the Atlantic was known as the Middle Passage because it was the middle part of the captive's journey. Many captured Africans attempted rebellions at sea, but most upbringings were crushed. During the journey to the Americas, which usually took about 6 weeks, up to half of the ship's captives might die. Over the hundreds of years of the Atlantic slave trade, from the early 1500s to the mid-19th century, 10 to 15% of all African captives died before reaching the Americas. The growth of the plantation economy and the expansion of slavery in the Americas led to significant changes that affected not only countless individuals, but also the broad patterns of history. The physical migration of captives had significant impact on the demographics of both Africa and the Americas. The exportation of enslaved people that was required to keep the population continuous caused a century-long decline in population in Africa, home countries. In addition to physical migration, slavery resulted in migration status from free person to enslaved, setting up social classes that remain influential today. Further, it disrupted family organizations since families were often separated and more men than women were taken captive. Polygamy became more common. With people treated as commodities, as in chattel slavery, social and family groupings were determined more by supply and demand than by the family bonds of kinship. Each region in which slavery was introduced was affected in a unique way. However, in all of them, people with African roots helped shape and enrich the language and culture of societies into which they were brought.